As the dawn of June 6, 1944, cast its somber light over the channel, an extraordinary scene unfolded before humanity's eyes. Never before had such a formidable armada has assembled across the vast expanse of sea. 130,000 men embarked aboard 7,000 vessels, their journey shielded by air cover from 20,000 planes. With the first glimmer of daylight amidst a relentless barrage of fire, these men would bravely storm the shores of France. An additional 20,000 would descend by air. The toll of that fateful day would be grim, with 10,000 Allied soldiers and a similar number of Germans lost. Yet 11 weeks later, Paris would taste liberation, paving the way for the march toward Berlin. To be recounted here unfolds through the eyes of both Allies and Germans, from its inception in Berlin in January 1944 to its climactic moments in the summer. Among the prominent figures featured are US General Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and countless unsung heroes who participated in the landings. Noteworthy is Sergeant Grant, who courageously documented the events at great personal risk. Together, they were part of a monument event, far from the triumph march often portrayed. Now, November 1st, 1943, to the Tehran Conference, where three heads of the state stood, having just made a pivotal decision. At the forefront stood a content Joseph Stalin, the paramount leader of the Soviet Union, surveying from atop the steps. Below him, a pensive Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, contemplated the implication. For 2 challenging years, Stalin, Churchill, and US President Roosevelt had grappled with a critical decision, the timing of invasion of Western Europe, on which the fate of the war in the world hinged. Since his nation's entry into the war against Germany in June 1941, Stalin had advocated for a second front in the West to elevate the pressure on his eastern forces locked in battle with Hitler. Meanwhile, influenced by Churchill's cautious strategy, the Anglo-Americans had sought to weaken the Axis by advancing through North Africa with hopes of invading southern Europe via Italy. However, their progress was halted near Naples, failing to breach deeper into Germany's defenses. Roosevelt grappled with uncertainty for an extended period. Questions lingered, pondering the readiness of his nation for such a momentum risk. Yet, a newfound determination arose within him to swiftly dismantle the Third Reich, particularly from the Western Front. Additionally, he held aspirations for post-victory collaborations with the Soviet. Churchill, albeit hesitant, eventually consented to this course of action. Since the United States entered the war in 1941, Hitler nursed concerns about the potential invasion of German occupying territories along the west coast of Europe. In 1942, he set in motion plans for a massive project, the construction of Atlantic Wall. This defensive barrier stretched almost 40,000 miles from northern Norway to the Spanish borders. Interestingly, despite widespread belief among Germans that the Allies would target the Calais region merely 25 miles from the British coasts, Hitler persisted with the construction to carry out his audacious endeavor. German authorities enlisted thousands of laborers, including French conscripts, refugees, Jews, and prisoners of war, necessitating a staggering 30 million tons of concrete. By the close of 1943, Fortress Europe seemed firmly under German control. On January 15, 1944, Eisenhower, personally chosen by Roosevelt, led the landings, arrived in London to coordinate Operation Overlord, and marked the beginning of a monumental and pivotal global endeavor. I remain steadfast in my belief that the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and all citizens of the United Nations can unequivocally demonstrate the unmatched strength of an empowered democracy. Shortly thereafter, Eisenhower introduced his team to the press, stirring the need for British second-in-command as American Supreme Commander. Thus, he appointed General Montgomery, also known as Monty, the esteemed hero of desert campaign in North Africa against Rommel, as commander of the Allied ground forces. Revered by his compatriots, Montgomery's leadership proved invaluable. The military leaders meticulously devised their strategy, ensuring utmost secrecy. Consequently, they found themselves standing before a faded, barely legible map. True to his nature, Monty sought the limelight, paying more attention to the cameras than his colleagues' ostentatious gestures. Despite the theatrics, the leaders had already settled to France for a landing, specifically Normandy over the Calais region. Normandy's beaches, though more distant from Britain, were less heavily fortified, rendering them the ideal choice. The invasion was scheduled for spring, between Ouistreham and Carentan, at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. Montgomery vigorously advocated for extending the front line towards Caen to avoid the risk of being confined to a small perimeter along the beaches. Moreover, he emphasized the importance of pushing the front further westward to Cherbourg, a pivotal deep water post essential for sustaining a sizable army. Maintaining utmost secrecy was imperative for success. It was crucial to keep the Germans completely unaware of the Allies' plans. Even as early as 1944, uncertainty persisted among them regarding the precise location of impending landings, necessitating an escalation of propaganda efforts. The arrival of Eisenhower in London only served to confirm Hitler's apprehension of an imminent Western invasion. Back in 1942, Hitler had bestowed upon Erwin Rommel the famed Desert Fox, the title of Field Marshal following his exploit with the African troops. By early 1944, Rommel, now tasked with bolstering the defenses of Fortress Europe, found himself in France, hindered by the Nazi air force's focus on countering Allied bombing raids from Germany. Rommel faced a shortage of air support in Normandy. The operational theater encompassed both lands and coastal regions, which Rommel perceived as inadequately defended. His strategy centered on bridging the gaps between fortified towns with a continuous defensive line, with advocating for increased mining along the coast. Nevertheless, the vast expanse of France's coastline, stretching from Calais to Lower Brittany over 750 miles, underscored the formidable challenge of such endeavors. Rommel's heightened activity didn't overly concern Eisenhower, given that the Allies had spent months constructing artificial ports, affording them flexibility in selecting their points of attack without an imminent reliance of capturing a genuine port. Despite the monumental task ahead, the Allies remained undeterred. Enormous concrete caissons, known as phoenixes, were posed to be towed off to the Normandy coast, serving as initial breakwaters. Additionally, floating docks would facilitate the unloading of materials and troops upon anchoring to vast steel pontoons, ensuring beach access regardless of tide levels, a remarkable engineering feat originating from British ports. In Britain, training regiments continued unabated. Both British and American forces employed various methods, often staged for cameras. Activities ranged from synchronized swimming to pyrotechnic displays, alongside rigorous equipment testing. Troops were prepared for the arrival of new American jeeps with anti-mine tanks, sand-crossing matting, and simulator drives on undulating tracks. Furthermore, the introduction of Churchill Kirkcudbright flame-throwing tanks promised to eliminate any remaining threats overlooked in bombing campaigns. It's a well-established fact that Americans tend to avoid engaging in battle unless they hold a clear advantage in power. By February 1944, over 800,000 US servicemen were already stationed in Britain, with more on the way. America continued to transport its equipment, including Sherman tanks aimed to rival the formidable panzers of German army. Meanwhile, Residents of small grey towns in England became acquainted with the new P-38 bombers, surpassing British planes in flying range. Accommodating these newcomers often posed challenges, sometimes required the displacement of an entire families, with tearful children witnessing the upheaval. A stay forced between the poor old British bloke and his spoiled cousin from America, particularly given the superior rations of the latter. Despite this, positive relationships were formed, as seen in seaside locales like Blackpool, where US servicemen relaxed during their off-duty hours, much to the delight of local girls and likely dismay of their absent husbands at war. Never before in His Majesty's realm had there been such a surge in divorces and illegitimate children. Nonetheless, British girls prevailed in wartime. Fraternization was widespread, and it seemed that all was going according to the plan. Yet, there was more than just dancing to win hearts. General Eisenhower always held his allies in high esteem. In March, he visited the esteemed military academy of Sandhurst, the alma mater of a young Winston Churchill, determined to convey his expectations to the cadets. Gentlemen, the responsibility to secure victory in this war rests upon your shoulders. Whether you command a tank crew, a platoon, or rise to lead a company, you must demonstrate unwavering leadership every hour of every day. You must intimately know each member of your unit. Mere excellence in combat prowess, strength, toughness, or technical proficiency is insufficient. You must be their guide, their support, their mentor. Only then will you fulfill your duty and honor the legacy of this esteemed institution and our great nation. As Ike spoke with his characteristic warmth and empathy, he understood that many of these young Britons, barely in their 20s, would soon sacrifice their lives defending a nation that had valiantly resisted the Nazi onslaught for the past 4 years. In that same March, with the impending approach of D-Day, Churchill took part in a realistic training exercise of a US paratrooper unit under the watchful gaze of Eisenhower himself. British newsreel producers went all out, capturing the action with onboard cameras. If not for the cigar, one might mistake this for the real deal. The cigar-wielding cameraman even flashes a smile. This footage later became integral for filmmakers depicting the initial US paratrooper landings in Normandy, even that they were not recorded in real time. Most significantly, Churchill threw his full support behind Operation Overlord, despite his initial reservation. While the Allied forces were consolidated in Britain, Hitler remained distant from the operation theaters, stationed in his eastern headquarters near the Soviet front, where he continued his strategy of division subjugation. In the theater of the Western Front, the German command found itself split between Marshal von Rundstedt, responsible for overseeing operation on the Western Front, and Marshal Rommel, tasked with coastal defense. Nevertheless, their perspectives diverged. Von Rundstedt favored keeping his armored division inland, poised to converge on specific areas once the Allies intimated their landings. Conversely, Rommel foresaw British and American air power disrupting German troop movements, prompting him to advocate positioning the armored divisions as close to the coast as possible to counter the enemy upon their arrival. Despite Rommel's instances, his proposal was rejected, leading him to concentrate on fortifying the breaches and implementing defensive measures like anti-tank obstacles, anti-landing craft barrages, chevaux de frise constructed from repurposed railroad tracks, effectively impeding any advances. Additionally, alterations to the train were undertaken to hinder the landings and thwart paratroopers' movements, including intentional flooding of land just beyond the coast. In preparation for a potential beach landing in southwest England, American infantry encountered the challenges of establishing a beachhead beneath a cliff potentially occupied by entrenched enemies. The primary objective was to establish a secure beachhead to facilitate communications for subsequent assault waves. Despite the need to dig in for shelter remaining vigilant against enemy fire remained paramount. In such circumstances, soldiers were encouraged to exhibit enthusiasm and patience, ensuring proper timing for equipment retrieval and attending to the wounded, contemplating scenarios reminiscent of future Omaha Beach, characterized by pebbly shores and challenging topography, highlighted the importance of meticulous preparation. The resemblance between training grounds in Devon and actual landing sites was deliberate. Through reconnaissance, assisted by the French resistance despite severe reprisals, furnished Allied forces with detailed intelligence on German defenses along the Channel coast. Leveraging this information, the Allies meticulously devised their plan of attack, shrouded in secrecy to maintain this effectiveness. Concurrently, a campaign of disinformation was waged against the Germans, feeding them false intelligence and executing decoy operations, such as constructing mock airfields in the Calais region, complete with inflatable aircrafts to divert attention from the true landing sites. In the southern region of England, where the majority of troops assembled, provisions, weaponry, and supplies were carefully concealed. However, by May, the extent of deployment became increasingly evident. Large contingents of soldiers were now stationed in various camps, strategically situated near their departure points to prevent any leaks to the local populace. Discipline among officers was lax to preserve troop morale. For example, at an RAF squadron, pilots were not mandated to undergo wing clipping before their missions over Normandy. Among the ranks lurked unseen individuals with a specific task of documenting the preparations, including the students of the British Army Film School and other volunteers. One such individual was Desmond O'Neill, aged 20, determined to chronicle the events of D-Day. Holding the rank of sergeant, he discovered that his camera served a welcome division for his comrades. On May 27th, Allied forces introduced French francs as the new currency, much to the charging of General Charles de Gaulle, who perceived it as an infringement upon French sovereignty. Meanwhile, soldiers grappled with the realization of the impending perils. Another cameraman, 27-year-old Sergeant Ian Grant, adorned in his Scottish beret, had enlisted in the film corps to evade mundane duties and immortalize his fellow soldiers. Grant documented the distributions of booklets detailing the forthcoming invasion of Normandy on May 31st, unveiling the target to the troops for the first time. He also captured the issuance of extra rations as they prepared for the impending conflict. On June 1st, Norman Clegg, another cameraman, recorded the final instructions delivered to his unit before embarking on their mission, leaving behind only Clapperboard as a testament to his endeavors. He filmed from an elevated vantage point, seemingly undaunted by the associated risks, all in the service of safeguarding the secrecy of his comrades' landing zones. Even they possessed scant knowledge of Eisenhower's location in Normandy. All remained veiled in utmost secrecy, resulting in their stringent isolation over the preceding fortnight. The die was cast for Clegg and his fellow cameraman as they embarked on their grand journey toward the ports. The US Army stood fully armed, boasting 1.5 million servicemen, outnumbering their British counterparts in southern England. In early June, a multitude of soldiers departed from their encampment amidst the gathered locals, bidding farewell to their newfound heroes. Each contingent headed towards its designed embarkation point among the 19 ports lining England's southern coast, while the British troops set sail from the east. American GIs departed from the west. Their next disembarkation would signify the commencement of the leading. The Canadian force, under British command and constituting the third largest Allied force, totaled 21,000 men. The logistical feat of reversing 20,000 vehicles into the ship holds for the swift beach deployment was remarkable, not to mention the transportation of thousands of tons of supplies over the initial 2 days. Eisenhower meticulously pondered various factors to optimize the invasion's success, including scheduling the operation during the night with a full moon for optimal visibility and a half tide at dawn for landing conditions. Only the 5th and 6th or 7th of June would suffice. To catch the enemy off guard, an earlier landing time was preferable. Thus, Ike settled on June 5th for the operation. However, adverse weather conditions plagued the day leading up to the 5th. On June 4th, as ships departed from northern England toward the Channel, a fierce storm erupted, compelling Eisenhower to recall the fleet already underway. Operation Overlord first imminent peril, as any movement detected might alert the Germans. Day and night, Ike and his team maintained close contact with the weather office, yet the forecast remained bleak for the ensuing fortnight, spelling potential disaster. Remotivation of the troops would be imperative, and the entire campaign might face truncation by 2 weeks. In the harbors where Eisenhower encountered delays in departure, the wait dragged on, agonizing while landing crafts circled like hungry predators in a watering hole. Desmond O'Neill found himself amidst fellow Brits of the 3rd Division on June 4th, grappling with an unyielding wind. Reflecting on their predicament, he observed, "We found ourselves stuck on board with little to do except eat or smoke. Provisions were abundant." He noted, "I had enough rations for 10 men all to myself." A sense of profound disappointment settled over them as they remained in the dark about their destination, except for the imminent Channel crossing. It was only later that they discovered their impending landing at Lyon-sur-Mer, a detail that held little significance for any of them. Throughout the ports of southern England on that fateful Sunday of June 4th, 1944, religious services were attended with unprecedented favor, particularly by the devout Canadian troops, perhaps sought solace and prayers for the challenges ahead. Meanwhile, the American remains occupied, recognizing that idleness would only diminish their readiness for the impending mission. By the evening on June 4th, the weather forecast provided a glimmer of hope, predicting calmer seas for the 5th and 6th. It was at this juncture that Eisenhower made the monumental decision that would reshape history. The fleet would set sail on June 6, 1944. On June 5th, the Allied machinery sprang into action with air assault on northern and western France, aimed at disrupting German defenses. For 3 consecutive days, Allied bombers relentlessly pounded lower Normandy, resulting in nearly 4,000 casualties among German forces and civilians. These bombing campaigns ignited heated debates between Eisenhower and Churchill, with the latter voicing concerns over the repercussions of such devastations on French sentiments. However, on the surprise of the Allies, the French resistance bravely declared, "This is war. Casualties are unavoidable." On June 3rd in Algiers, General de Gaulle transformed the French Committee of Nation Liberations into the provisional government of the French Republic, asserting his authority after being kept uninformed by the Allies. With the liberation of France on the horizon, the British and Americans acknowledged the pivotal role of the de Gaulle in securing the cooperation of the French people in resistance. Thus, on June 4th, following Churchill's summons, de Gaulle departed for Britain, resolved to assert his perspective. He staunchly refused to allow the Allies to dictate terms. Nonetheless, despite their hesitance to grant him complete authority, the diligent general agreed to support Overlord. On June 5th, at sea, diversionary maneuvers were in full swing. A multitude of small vessels headed north of Le Havre. Their smokestack emitted steam, serving both as a smokescreen and to mislead the Germans into believing a massive armada was advancing across the Channel towards a position significantly north of the targeted Normandy beaches. General Eisenhower had always argued that a leader's place is alongside his troops, both before and during battle. In the late afternoon of June 5th, Greenham Common Airfield, just hours before departure, he visited the US 101st Airborne Division, slated to be among the first to set foot on French soil. Despite the tension on the line, Ike's smile, it was all the more crucial for the paratroopers to maintain a brave demeanor and reassure their leader. That evening, Eisenhower stayed until the very end, seeing off the last aircraft. Meanwhile, a little further away, the reconnaissance paratroopers, without their leader's physical presence or encouragement, devised their own methods to show courage. Whether embodying real redskins for the idealized myth of the Native American warrior, these young Iroquois adorned themselves with the scarlet war paint, mentally preparing for the imminent action. Those without paint chose to darken their faces with charcoal to reduce visibility, alongside their weapons and parachutes. These men carried radio transmitters to mark landing zones for the majority of troopers delivered by gliders. These men were required to assist each paratrooper aboard, fully aware of the daunting odds they faced. That same night, I drafted a letter in case the landing ended in disaster, emphasizing the Allies' uncertainty. My decision to attack at this time and place, he wrote, was based on the best information available. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. However, for weeks, the Allies had been refining a carefully crafted plan. On the night of June 5th, German coastal defenses were targeted for destruction by bombing. Naval artillery began firing at dawn for a position 45 miles offshore. The British and Canadians were assigned the right flank of the invasion, tasked with assaulting these breaches. Sword, Juno, and Gold, situated between Oysterham and Arromanches. Meanwhile, the Americans took charge of the left flank, concentrating on Omaha and Utah beaches. The British aimed to swiftly capture Cone due to his pivotal role as a communication hub, facilitating German reinforcements. Additionally, its strategic position on flat terrain facilitated the deployment of Allied armored divisions and the establishment of temporary airfields. Concurrently, the Americans planned to advance toward Cherbourg, aiming for its capture within a week to facilitate the influx of troops and equipment essential to the ensuing offensive phase. Starting at 3:15 a.m. on June 6, Allied aircraft began bombarding German positions across all landing sectors, followed by naval artillery at dawn, aimed at breaching the Atlantic Wall. Initial attention focused on Omaha Beach, near the Cotentin Peninsula, where establishing a beachhead was crucial before linking up with force at Utah Beach and advancing toward Cherbourg. Numerous aerial bombardments veered off their intended target due to mistimed arrivals. Likewise, naval artillery operations faced challenges with timing, dictated by tidal conditions, which hampered the intended destruction of coastal defenses. The burden of the assault fell heavily on the battle-hardened soldiers of the Big Red One, with support from the less experienced 116th Battalion. Landing craft, released too far from the shore amidst rough seas, subjected troops to be cramped, uncomfortable conditions reminiscent of pack animals. Robert Capa, the lone photographer on the scene, vividly portrayed the chaotic atmosphere, highlighting the deafening cacophony and palpable fear felt by those aboard. Upon landing, the men were met with staunch German resistance, leading to the grueling battle reminiscence of a turkey shoot. Unforeseen tidal shifts compounded the challenges, leaving subsequent waves of attackers stranded amidst Romans' formidable sea defenses, hindered by enemy fire and treacherous currents. Troops struggled to make headway, with some tragically succumbing under the weight of their gear. Capturing the desperation of the moment, Capa's surviving photographs offered a poignant glimpse into the brutal reality faced by Allied forces on the momentous day. The ocean turned crimson, and the moniker Bloody Omaha would later haunt the memory of Omaha Beach. Contemplating the cancellation of the offensive, the U.S. command confronted a grim dilemma, abandoning those already ashore to their fates. With hundreds already fallen or wounded, the notion of halting the operation weighed heavily. Such a decision would leave a significant gap in the Allied front precisely when the war machine was gearing up in full force. As dawn broke on June 6, a vast armada of 7,000 vessels emerged on the horizon, bound for the Normandy coast, and as always, Ike, not far away, addressed the word via the BBC at 9:45 a.m. I call upon all who value freedom to stand with us now, maintaining unwavering faith. Our determination knows no bounds. Together, victory shall be ours. Spanning a 45-mile front, nearly one boat was positioned every 250 meters, shielded by air cover from 11,000 planes, all adorned with the white stripes to prevent friendly fire. Fortunately, not every stretch of coastline mirrored the carnage of Omaha. German defenses faltered, misled by Allied deception that sowed confusion regarding the primary target being Calais. The Atlantic Wall began to crumble, along with German anti-aircraft defenses, overwhelmed by Allied forces. Acted a staggering 10,000 sorties without facing any retaliation, while B-26s dropped their final payloads inland. Fighter planes relentlessly targeted enemy positions, not confining their attacks to just the coastal areas but also striking at airfields to keep enemy aircraft grounded. Key infrastructure such as communication centers, roads, bridges, and railways suffered systematic destructions. Simultaneously, the French resistance, after executing intelligence and sabotage missions, launched assaults to disrupt German reinforcements. The combined efforts of Allied forces and the resistance effectively stalled the advance of German troops summoned by Britain and the southern banks of Loire River. Rommel's strategic positioning of his troops near the beaches in anticipation of invading to be eschewed. The British 3rd Infantry Division focused on seizing Sword Beach, with the objective of neutralizing defenses of Ouistreham and capturing Cone on the same day. Notably, the brave Scots of the 45th Command of the Royal Marines, immortalized by Sergeant Ian Grant's camera, prepared to land on Ouistreham. Reflecting on the experience, Grant wrote, "This first-hand encounter was unquestionably authentic. I strove to capture the vastness of the fleet as accurately as possible, from my vantage point, almost at sea level, despite being provided with sufficient rations and seasickness remedies. The strong smell of diesel fumes caused discomfort to many, even the most resistant among us. The sky was abuzz with aircraft, some flying at low altitudes as instructed, enabling us to identify them through the loudspeakers and discern friend from foe. We encouraged the men to pay little attention to the cameras, urging them to delve into their thoughts and emotions, revealing their true selves. I found comfort in an unwavering composure, devoid of fear, but brimming with a fervent longing to escape the confines of a nauseating vessel. As we approached the shoreline, the cacophony of noise reached a crescendo. Amidst the chaos, a ramp malfunctioned, leading everyone to converge on the remaining gangplank, each struggling under the weight of their backpacks. Grant and his comrades were spread from the initial assault, but their trials awaited as they prepared to rendezvous with the paratroopers deployed behind enemy lines. Sergeant O'Neill, the youngest among us, had already reached Sword Beach, documenting the chaotic final moments of the battle amidst the thick haze of smoke. Reality seemed surreal, surpassing anything seen in cinema. The congested exits from the beach made escape seem almost impossible. I followed alongside an infantry platoon, desperately trying to break free from the chaos. At that moment, the sudden jerk of the camera signaled O'Neill's tragic fate, struck down by enemy fire. He succeeded in capturing the final fleeting moment before being evacuated for medical care. Farewell, Sergeant O'Neill, and accolades to your comrades who bravely seized Sword Beach that day. Albeit at the cost of 600 lives lost or wounded, their identities submerged in anonymity, many barely 20 years old. The captured German soldiers were gathered on the beaches, while just a few miles away at Juno Beach in the Canadian sector, soldiers were assigned the task of taking Carpiquet, Cone Airport. What must have been crossed the minds of these young soldiers after traveling 5,000 miles to land at Berniers, an unfamiliar coastal village in Normandy. This footage captures the initial assault wave, the only recording of the landings, albeit taken by an automated camera fixed to the bulkhead. Yet, even through the impassive lens of machinery, moments of raw humanity was preserved. Soon, the very first French home would be liberated in Normandy, a victory attained at the expense of 100 lives, a scene Allied cameramen were instructed to refrain from documenting. Instead, attentions turned to the capture of the first German prisoners and the visceral reaction of a proud Frenchman towards them. The surrender of the Germans failed to mask the difficulties faced by the soldiers on Juno Beach, where rough seas impeded the landing of second assault wave. A total of 300 young Canadians perished, yet their sacrifice proved worthwhile. With the establishment of the Beachhead, their surviving comrades initiated their advance toward Cone. Among the first signs of progress were the reactions of young French women, delighted to witness their country liberated by these soldiers, many of whom spoke French, albeit with a musing accent. However, despite British Admiral Ramsay's satisfied expression at the contribution of his fleet, General Eisenhower appeared apprehensive at Allied headquarters in Portsmouth. Throughout the day, he received a barrage of messages, some disconcerting from Omaha and other encouraging from Utah or within the Britain sector. The expression on Ike's face betrayed the ongoing struggle. 6 hours after the landing at Omaha, troops remained entangled at the foot of the cliff. The Americans spared no effort in supporting the troops, providing whether additional aid was necessary. Even the initial assault teams were accompanied by a scaled medical corps ready to attend to the wounded. Regardless of this alliance, the urgency of medical care was never more apparent than at bloody Omaha, where casualties lay alongside handful of captives. These thousands of Americans' lives were lost on the deadliest of the 5 landing beaches. However, as the day progressed and initial forces secured beachheads and advanced islands, reinforcements poured in at Omaha. Finally, it could be declared that the landing had achieved success. The focus now shifted to a subsequent battle for Normandy in France. General Montgomery, arrival 2 days later, was met with concern. Renowned for his penchant for overwhelming superiority prior to taking action, he hesitated in deploying his armored division and consequently failed to seize Cone as planned on the initial day. Additionally, his troops, while relieved at their relatively unscathed landing, seemed to lack resolve. This sentiment was mirrored by their cameraman, leisurely capturing moments of interaction with the initial French civilians who appeared cooperative for the cause. On June 8th, Norman Clegg, known as a man with a clapperboard, documented the initial moments of reconciliation as German prisoners and wounded were no longer under threat from their former enemies. Tragically, just 5 days later, Clegg fell victim to German gunfire. His story epitomizes the intertwining of compassion and morbidity. Nevertheless, this footage also reveals a relaxation in British efforts the day following D-Day, which the Germans swiftly exploited, despite one Rondist's directive to hold back. German forces, including the renowned 12th Panzer, Hitlerjugend SS, launched counterattacks on June 7th, 8th, and 9th, impeding the British and Canadians' advance towards Cone and bolstering their defenses around the city. This strategic maneuver rendered bombing raids on Cone ineffective, although it provided fodder for German propaganda depicting their soldiers enduring the same hardships as the city inhabitants. As the German army retrained control, the arrival of liberators signaled the departure of the initial wave of refugees. The German counteroffensive also left several Allied paratrooper divisions isolated, scattered across imprecise drop zones, making them vulnerable to recapture. Despite heavy casualties, these troops remained steadfast, sacrificing greatly to be the first to set foot on French soil. Their scattered landings also served to confront the Germans, magnifying the perception of Allied strength. On June 9th, American forces seized the town of Isny, which had endured intense bombardment in order to definitely expel the Germans. The German defense of Isny had impeded the link-up between Allied forces from Omaha and Utah beaches, delaying their joint advance toward Cherbourg. However, with Isny secured, an Allied front stretched over 60 miles from Oysterham to the Cotentin beachhead, restoring unity. The people of Isny couldn't help but turn their attention toward the sea, where a French vessel was finally navigating the Channel. With the coastal position secure, all eyes eagerly awaited the arrival of General de Gaulle, the leader of the provisional French government. De Gaulle, known for his independence, set foot on French soil at Courcelles after 4 years of exile. Churchill's lingering distrust of de Gaulle was apparent in his instructions to Montgomery, advising caution in welcoming the French leader. De Gaulle's visit was brief, reflecting the urgency of the times. It was time to echo Montgomery's sentiments, and the British Field Marshal graciously allowed him to take the lead. Monty was tasked Norman Johnson, his personal cameraman, with shadowing de Gaulle, perhaps to keep a watchful eye on him. While accustomed to catering to his leader's demands, Johnson found de Gaulle's story intriguing. Keeping pace with him was a challenge, he remarked, but luckily his height made him stand out. Despite this stern demeanor, de Gaulle managed to maintain a positive atmosphere. He seemed to pay no mind to the Canberra's presence, or at least pretended not to. It was clear that a rising star was in the making. In Beja, there was a widespread celebration at the night of Frenchmen liberated from German oppression, symbolizing the restoration of sovereignty. Particularly notable was de Gaulle's determination to stand alongside his compatriots and members of the resistance, excluding British or American forces, before proceeding to the town hall where he installed his own appointees without consulting the Allies. He firmly rejected any outside influence in France's political decisions, asserting his authority over the nation. While ports were necessary for troop landings, the need for artificial harbors became apparent to sustain the ongoing battle and support the logistics and provisions for a multitude of Allied soldiers. Each day, 150 to 200 vessels unloaded approximately 7,000 vehicles, 50,000 tons of supplies, and numerous personnel at the ports of Arromanches and Omaha, in the British and American sector, respectively. Soon the weather took a turn for the worse, threatening to disrupt the operation once more. Normandy hadn't seen such a storm in 4 decades. Within the harbors, ships were violently tossed out. The line of caissons proved inadequate against the onslaught. To worsen the matters, some broke loose, allowing the waves to flood the port. Floating docks and gangplanks became unmoored, swept away like debris. The tempest persisted for a full 4 days, hindering the flow of materials and reinforcements. The morning of June 23rd arrived with clear skies, revealing a disheartening sight of numerous ships and rigs stranded along the beaches. Despite swift efforts by British engineers to rebuild the port of Arromanches, the US port of Omaha remained inactive. The operation was running 10 days behind schedule, urging US troops to prioritize the capture of the deep water port of Cherbourg, still firmly in German hands. Finally, on June 26, US infantry breached the suburbs on the same day before a gathered press he seemed to disdain. Lieutenant General von Schilbern, the garrison's commandant, surrendered. Though his imposing figure politely acknowledged defeat before his conqueror, the young General Collins, he hesitated to fulfill his oath to Hitler, opting for surrender over death. Schilbern capitulated even before his troops, who didn't relinquish their arms until the following day. With a loss of 22,000 men since D-Day, the Americans weren't always lenient with prisoners, a somewhat justifiable stance. The prisoners varied ages, from elderly to youth, underscored the weakening of the German army in the west. As its seasoned troops battled the Red Army in the east, Cherbourg now held 36,000 captives, a significant figure, though cameras often capture a moment that endure in our memory. With the fall of Cherbourg, one of the final segments of Atlantic Wall crumbled, while the faces of their men showed weariness. Captured officers maintained a semblance of pride, or perhaps shame. Following the capture of Cherbourg, Hitler assumed personal command of the German army in the west, replacing von Rundst with a more compellent Field Marshal von Clegg, who had suggested a ceasefire. Rommel, disheartened by Hitler's unwavering stance, His role now was to delay impending disaster. Meanwhile, Eisenhower shared concerns. Despite success at Cherbourg, Cone, the intended launching point for an offensive against German lines, remained uncaptured by Montgomery. Situated inland, the German army held strategic advantages in space, supplies, and reinforcements, while the Allies were confined along the Channel coast. The American had no choice but to breach the enemy's front line in the contending. Traversing the intricate Bookage landscape presented formidable obstacles, with hedgerows offering ample defense cover. The capacity to observe without being detected conferred a significant advantage to the adversary, catching the American troops off guard for the impending battle. In this rapid-flying environment, a mere handful of tenacious fighters could halt the progress of an entire battalion. Surrendering one of those square fields necessitated maneuvering around the flanks. American tanks, constrained to the roads, became vulnerable targets, particularly when crossing exposed leaves, exposing their unprotected undersides to enemy fire. This Bookage entrapments extracted a heavy toll, claiming thousands of GI lives and thwarting endeavors to breach what gained notoriety as this cursed countryside. Of chaos, individuals coped in their own ways. Who was the German organist in the desolate Normandy church? A madman, a hated foe, a music enthusiast, or perhaps a disillusioned soldier of Hitler, seeking solace amidst the horrors of conflict? Winston Churchill's arrival a few days later aimed to assess the situation firsthand. Despite Montgomery's efforts to showcase progress, the plain of Cone remained firmly under German control, much to Churchill's disappointment. 10 days after the city's fall, the British had yet to breach the Germans' defenses, frustrating Churchill's aspirations. Eisenhower, counting on a breakthrough in the Legion, deemed the outcome a significant setback given the resources expended. Incuriously, he entrusted crucial decisions to the discreet 3-star general, Omar Bradley, who had overseen the landings at Omaha and Utah beaches. Eisenhower admired Bradley's poise, clarity, and effectiveness. Bradley believed the Americans could rupture enemy lines in the Cotentin Peninsula. Operation Cobra, likened to a coiled snake striking decisively, was formulated to achieve this objective. Precision bombing raids aimed to obliterate German positions, facilitating simultaneous advances on Brittany, the scene, and the Loire. On July 25th, Allied bombers targeted the road between St. Lo and Perriers, where the opposing forces were entrenched. The renowned armored division under General Lehr, Field Marshal Rommel's deputy, met its demise. Finally, American forces were able to depart from the challenging terrain of the Bookage and commence the breakout. This pivotal moment signified a significant breach in the enemy's defense line. Moreover, upon observing a substantial number of surrenders, they apprehended a considerable portion, albeit many being minor figures. In the altered landscape of Normandy, tanks were now fitted with blades to maneuver through the hedgerows and traverse the remaining stretches of Bookage. By the close of July, subsequent to the breakthrough, American armored divisions had progressed to Coutances, Avranches, and Granville, the final Normandy ports before Brittany. In early August, the 2nd French Armored Division made landfall at Utah Beach. These French soldiers had sacrificed everything for months, even years, to combat the Germans and Italians in North Africa. This time, they stood prepared to secure victory on their beloved French soil. Leading them was General Leclerc, a slender figure characterized by unwavering courage and integrity. Despite his aristocratic lineage, he could have sided with Vichy, yet he opted to back the Gaulle as early as June 1940. Now, he returned as a liberator of his homeland. His division amalgamated with the American Third Army, granting him participation in operations on French territory under General Bradley's command. Meanwhile, under the watchful eye of American filmmaker George Stevens, Montgomery, ever mindful of the camera, engaged with a contingent of Yankee soldiers, displaying his adaptiveness in such situations. Yielding to pressure from Eisenhower, the British Field Marshal consented to allowing the Americans to oversee the final battle's organization. Bradley's optimism for favorable outcome also relied heavily on the leadership of General Patton. Renowned for his Colt 45 always at his side, Patton embodied sheer determination. He famously quipped, "At the first sign of trouble, they expect me to bail them out," a sentiment that resonated deeply. As dawn broke, the Germans launched a final desperate assault, emanating from the plains of Cone with a counteroffensive on Mortain, aimed at pushing the Allies back to the coastline. Personally orchestrated by Hitler, this assault was swiftly met with Allied typhoons raining down rockets. It stood no chance, von Clegg lamented, before tragically ending his own life. This marked the culmination of German offenses in the West, compounding German troubles. Bradley strategically allowed enemy advances at Mortain, ensnaring them between American forces to the south and British forces to the north. Bradley could now execute his long-planned maneuver, trapping the retreating German between advancing British divisions from the Cone Plains and US armies from the south, effectively encircling them between Argenteuil and Falaise. Once the German counteroffensive at Mortain faltered, Patton swiftly led his divisions toward Le Mans, aiming for Paris. However, a portion of his forces diverted toward Argenteuil, executing a sweeping movement that encircled the Germans. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Canadians secured a crucial position, linking the Allies. The German army faced complete devastation. Eisenhower later described the Falaise battlefield as the most harrowing he had ever witnessed, reminiscent of Dante's Inferno. For hundreds of yards, one could not tread without encountering the dead and decaying. Estimates suggest between 5,000 and 6,000 Germans perished. The condition of those captured confirmed Eisenhower's grim assessment. Evacuating to 40,000 prisoners from Falaise would take several days for them. Captivity symbolized a triumph of life over death. While the German army had mobilized forces across occupied territories, not all were prepared to sacrifice themselves for the Third Reich. Normandy marked the definitive end of the German army, with victory secured at the Battle of Falaise. The prisoners accounted for, Patton's forces crossed the Seine and the Loire. Eisenhower had achieved the geographic objectives outlined in Operation Overlord and now set his sights on the next phase. Advancing into Germany itself on August 19th, Paris cloaked in smoke. The news of Allies' advance galvanized the city into action, rising against its oppressors. The decision to abandon the French capital came directly from the German army itself. From a high vantage point, one could witness convoy after convoy leaving Paris, journeying eastward with little regard for the obstacles in their way. The stark image of a group of 5 Germans engulfed in flames became a haunting memory. Yet, this doesn't diminish the bravery of those who resisted the occupiers before the Allies' arrival, nor does it lessen the sacrifice of those who fought against the retreating German forces. The next day, de Gaulle paid a visit to Eisenhower's headquarters. Eisenhower's inclination was to avoid transforming Paris into yet another battleground. He leaned toward encircling the city, compelling the Germans to surrender and seizing Paris, as if plucking ripe fruit. However, the Prussian French leader swayed Eisenhower to enter the city, not only to prevent potential bloodshed, but also to quell the emergence of communist resistance factions. Yielding to de Gaulle's argument, Eisenhower consented, and Bradley agreed to deploy Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, celebrated for its achievement at Falaise, to lead the entry into Paris and accept the German surrender. Following several instant battles south of the capital, the sky over the suburb cleared. Women abandoned themselves in red, and men wore white shirts, creating a tricolor spectacle to welcome Leclerc's troops at the gates of Paris. Within the city, jubilation was rampant. On that day, the gamble made by the man who rallied the French people on June 18, 1940, paid dividends. The miracle had transpired. France, once downtrodden and humiliated, now stood among the victors. The victory parade down the Champs-Élysées would further cement this legend, but that's a tale quintessentially French. Our narrative shifts to the following day, set in a less enchanting local, at the Place de la Concorde, leading a nation still uncertain of its political trajectory. De Gaulle sought Eisenhower's validation of his authority before the French populace. Eisenhower readily complied, as did General Bradley. However, it was Eisenhower's modesty that relegated him to the background while de Gaulle assumed center stage. Eisenhower was eager to orchestrate a march of US troops who would persist in the fight against the Third Reich. The Americans astutely recognized that in the post-war landscape, amidst global political divisions, they needed France as a key ally in Europe.